Thank you so much for joining us on At Issue. I'm H. Wayne Wilson. You may have heard the term non-point pollution. We've tried to tackle that issue, and it's usually associated with agriculture, but we've tried to tackle that issue by putting in buffer strips along streams. We've done no-till, we've done cover crops, things of that nature. But today we're going to talk about how to solve the problem of non-point pollution. Nutrient pollution is what we're talking about, using wetlands. And they've been studying it over in McLean County for a short period of time. We're going to talk about the results and how it might impact your drinking water. And so to have that discussion, we have the owner of some land over in McLean County near Lexington, and his name is John Franklin. John, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much.
And to talk about the water quality aspect of this, Rick Twait. Rick is the superintendent of water purification for the city of Bloomington. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the person who is behind the driving force behind the wetland idea is Maria Lemke. Maria is with the Nature Conservancy, where she is an aquatic ecologist. The first question is, what's an aquatic ecologist?
Well, in my case, it's someone who studies freshwater systems. So I study rivers, wetlands, specifically protecting and restoring types of habitats.
So with regard to wetlands, I think people might be familiar with, in southern Illinois, there's a cypress wetland, and it's wet all the time. What kind of wetland are we talking about? How big might it be?
In McLean County, the wetlands we're looking at installing are very small wetlands, typically somewhere between half an acre and maybe an acre or two in size. So they're relatively small. They capture water specifically from tile drains, and so they don't stay wet all year round like some of your bigger wetlands might. They typically dry out in the summertime and re-wet again in the fall as the rains start coming in the fall. You
mentioned tiles, and for those of you that aren't in agriculture, tiles run underneath the ground. Farmers put them in to drain the land. You're actually interrupted. The reason for this is because the level of nitrates and phosphorus is higher in tile water than in surface runoff?
Right, so the nitrates are very concentrated in the tile runoff, and a lot of the practices you mentioned earlier are very good and designed specifically to capture surface runoff and reduce topsoil erosion and capture that water. But the tile systems typically are underground. The tile enters into the stream system underneath a lot of those practices that are put in. And so it's a direct transport of this highly concentrated nitrate water into the stream systems. So the wetlands we're talking about are relatively small, and what they're designed to do is interrupt that tile, run the tile through the small wetland system first, and then on out into the stream. So we're not interrupting tile flow back in the fields, we're just retaining it on the land a little bit longer for different processes to occur to reduce the nitrates.
And the reason we're worried about nitrates, especially with drinking water, is?
Nitrates are a regulated compound. They do have some potential health effects with infants under 6 months. And there is a limit on the nitrate concentrations in drinking water of 10 milligrams per liter expressed as N, as nitrogen.
And that's of particular interest to the city of Bloomington because you have had nitrate problems in you've got two reservoirs, but in particular Bloomington, Lake Bloomington, right, is of concern.
Yes, we actually exceeded the limit in the drinking water in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We haven't since, which we're very fortunate. And that's a function of having two reservoirs from which to draw our water. The biggest problem that we have is that we cannot reliably or continuously use Lake Bloomington as a water supply because a lot of times in the spring the nitrate concentrations exceed that drinking water limit. We currently don't have any processes at the plant to remove nitrate from water. It's a very difficult compound to remove. You have to use a process called ion exchange. And we don't have that in there, but we are working on the land to try and reduce the nitrates coming into the reservoir.
And let me turn back to the idea of interrupting the tile. Could you better explain what that means? I mean, I told people that the tile runs underneath the ground, but can you explain what a tile is and how we interrupt it?
Well, I think in general the tile is to lower the level of the water in the soil, so it allows farmers to get into the ground sooner in the spring to plant and just keeps the water level or the water in the soil a manageable level. But these fields have been crisscrossed by tiles for 150 years in some cases. And so what the attempt to do now is to take the water that's coming out of those tiles and insert what is effectively a filter or the wetland in that tile. The water goes through the wetland and then continues on through to the tile where it would have drained previous to having the wetland in there.
And this is of particular interest in Illinois because we, through either urban areas or agricultural, we have reduced the amount of wetland that originally was here when the Europeans arrived in the state of Illinois by more than 90%.
That's correct. And so one reason these wetlands work so well in this area of Illinois is because historically it was a very marshy, wet habitat anyway. And so the soils are there and they hold water very well. So basically what we're talking about when we talk about putting in these small treatment wetlands is just restoring some of that historical landscape function of retaining, like John said, retaining that water on the land a little bit longer for some of these microbial processes, plant processes to happen that takes up some of that nitrate, removes it before it's exported into the river system.
Before we get any further in the conversation, microbial processes. Is that the key to this? The microbes use the nitrate?
Exactly. So that's one of the primary processes of reducing the nitrate is there's certain bacteria that use that nitrate. They metabolize the nitrate, but they release off the nitrate as an N2 gas. And so that gas is released into the atmosphere, and that's a permanent loss of that nitrate, excess nitrate, into the atmosphere as N2 gas, which is what we like to see. Plants use it too, but they tend to recycle nutrients in the system, so we'd like to see that permanent loss. And so you create these small wetlands are shallow. They create the perfect environment for those particular bacteria to thrive and to use up that nitrate.
So explain to me Maria mentioned they're small, but on your property, how many wetlands do you have? How big, how far apart? Where do they get placed?
This is on probably a total of a 200-acre piece of ground, and there are 3 sets of experimental wetlands. So each one of them has a group of 3 wetlands, and they're measuring the water as it moves from one wetland to the other. So each of those groups of 3 are collecting water from different parts of the fields. The water will be tiled into one set of 3 or another set of 3, and then running those experiments on all 3 of those sets of wetlands.
So they're spread across your property.
Right, right.
How close to, this watershed goes into Lake Bloomington and into the Mackinac River, is that correct?
The water coming off of John's farm runs into the Mackinac.
Goes into the Mackinac River. That's within a quarter mile from these wetlands.
But in regard to Lake Bloomington or Evergreen for that matter?
Both of those empty into the Mackinac River as well. We have similar landscapes, similar conditions, though, where the results from Maria's research on John's land and those wetlands can be directly applied to lands that drain into both of our reservoirs.
So long term, if this is effective and if landowners agree to implement what you have implemented, could this be a cost savings or just a benefit in terms of quality of drinking water, or both?
Right now, the economics are being worked out for that. There's a possibility that it would be in long-term a cost savings. One of the things that's really attractive about this method is that it works all the time. It doesn't require the building of what's referred to as gray infrastructure, things at the buildings at the plant and processes, and it also has the ancillary benefits of having like habitat improvement. And again, the thing, it's working all the time. We don't have to worry and monitor and make sure that we have to turn it on and keep it running. They work 24 hours a day.
When is there a bigger threat of nitrate in terms of the drinking water?
Well, usually after the fall, when we start getting the nitrogens applied to the fields and it's not being taken up by the crops, when you have water movement going through that water column and then being intercepted by the tile going into the stream, that's when you have higher nitrate concentrations going into the stream. And that persists throughout the spring. So it's usually late fall through late spring when that's the biggest problem.
Rick mentioned nutrient application. What historically has been, because that's when we talk about tile carrying high levels of nitrates and phosphorus, that's from the injection of nutrients in the fall?
Well, it's been a trend, I think, that's changed more to split application. So doing some in the fall and then following up in the spring, either pre-planting or after planting. And they're doing more experimenting with applying the nitrogen at even later stages in the corn development when it might need it more, which would be, I think, a help as well, because it will allow the corn to take up the nitrogen much more quickly when it's in a stage when it needs the nitrogen. So there's been I think, a trend to kind of spread out the application of nitrogen.
So fall application, there is no root structure to absorb the nutrient.
And Maria can probably answer this better, but it sits in there and is waiting to be used when there is some plant development, I think.
Typically, after harvest, then the anhydrous is applied, so there's not any crops on the field. And so they can apply it with some type of chemical that might reduce the nitrate from changing from ammonia, the anhydrous from changing into nitrate, because once it changes into nitrate, it's transported very quickly with water. So there's things you can do to keep it in that anhydrous form over the winter, but basically it just sits there in the soil until the crops are planted in the spring.
So, well, I'm sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
Good. Oh, I was just saying, I think John's right. I think there's more and more interest and more research being conducted in how to actually apply, to change that application into applying the anhydrous closer to when the corn can actually take it up. So there's more and more trying to reduce the amount that's applied in the fall and split it into spring to where maybe some pre-plant, and then once the plant has roots, you can apply it then. So there's more interest in that these days.
So why apply in the fall at all?
It's a timing. There's a short window. As people farm more and more ground, there's a lot of ground to cover in the spring, and the application window can be pretty tight. So I think a lot of it's just a timing thing, is trying to get some of it done in the fall. So if you do have a wet spring, you'd have trouble getting the nitrogen in, or you'd be putting it in on ground that was too wet, and so you want to travel the ground when you're not compacting it from having too much moisture in the ground. So it's probably just a timing and logistics of getting it done.
I want to talk a little bit about some of these, because there's surface runoff. There is much less nutrient problem with surface runoff than in tile runoff.
With surface runoff, you may have more sediment, being running off with the water that could have a lot of phosphorus attached to it. Nitrates, typically we see the higher nitrates coming through the tile, so it's a little different nutrient pattern.
So the wetland is basically to take care of the nitrate problem.
That's how it's designed, is to capture that tile water for nitrates. But what we're finding is that they are also really effective at reducing phosphorus.
Okay.
So.
And then with regard to, and I just want to touch, before we go back to the water quality issue, I want to touch on some of the surface runoff control measures. Cover crops and what else?
Well, you have field borders. Obviously, waterways have been used for a long time in controlling runoff and some of the erosion. So, we do have some bottomland wetlands as well that capture surface runoff, probably more so than the tile. But the buffer strips and field borders help a lot.
And what kind of cover crops are you using to help control that?
We've done radishes and rye, and again, there's many other sources of cover crops. I think around here, those two have seemed to work the best.
And when we talk about, we're talking about nitrates and the quality of the water in Bloomington or any other community, I suppose. But there's also a question of the dead zone down in the Gulf of Mexico. Is this also going to help that?
Sure, and that is the bigger picture. So there's local issues with drinking water. There's also Gulf hypoxia issues. So Illinois is one of the larger contributors of nutrients to the Gulf hypoxia, or the Gulf of Mexico. So any way we can effectively reduce nitrate runoff into the river systems is going to help that larger scale too. It's going to take a lot to treat that, but we're definitely contributing to that.
When we talk about taking a lot, that means more farmers, and I'm not focusing just on farmers, I understand there's other sources, but what, in your discussions with other landowners in the area, how receptive are they to the idea of taking a little bit of land out of production in order to create a wetland to help the overall picture?
Well, I think everybody, I think, appreciates the scope of the problem, and there's some interest in there. It's again, it's a little bit of a hard sell sometimes in trying to get people to take ground out of production, particularly in a couple of years where we've had high grain prices and very profitable years. So there's some challenges in just getting people to understand that if you put a wetland in, it's not permanent. Generally, they're 10-year programs, but they can come out of the program at that time if you decided you wanted to.
But there is a reimbursement from the government, like we know the CREP program with buffer strips.
Right.
Now, so you do get at least some.
Yeah, very similar. They're going to come up with an annual cash rent based on kind of the value of, at the time you sign up, of what kind of the going rate is for that type of ground. Depends on the type of ground and that kind of thing. But it can be an attractive rate.
So it's all about money.
It's a lot about money, sure.
And also money, when you do this ion exchange, is that what you call it?
Yes.
That creates some sort of a brine?
Well, when you regenerate it, ion exchange can be viewed not unlike water softeners at home that many people have in their basements. You see the big bags of salt in some of the grocery stores and the big discount stores on pallets. Well, it works about the same way. There's a special material that is treated to where it can take nitrates onto its surface, and in exchange it'll send off a chloride ion. But when those sites get loaded up with nitrates, it can no longer remove it. So then you have to regenerate it. The way you do that is to get a very strong salt solution, brine solution, that you run through those, and then it will remove the nitrates that it had taken up. And then you have a waste disposal issue on that. But then that just regenerates the column in order to be able to start its treatment again. You have to find a place to put the brine.
So by looking at the wetlands solution, or at least that would be a partial solution to your problem.
Right, and we really have high hopes for that. It is, as Maria had said, the nitrates come in, the bacteria in the sediments reduce that to nitrogen gas, goes into the atmosphere, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. And no real waste stream, which is very attractive, I mean, you know, on a number of different levels.
I don't want to get too scientific, but we keep throwing around the word microbe. What's a microbe?
Well, it's just a common name for a bacteria. There's a lot of different types of bacteria. And this is when we're talking about the microbes in the wetlands, we're talking about specific ones that can take in nitrate and use that for energy. But
Are they naturally there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're in the soils. It takes, like I said earlier, it takes a certain environment for them to be activated necessarily and thrive.
Yeah, they thrive in the absence of oxygen. They live in anoxic conditions where the nitrate has some oxygen on it. It takes that as part of its metabolic processes, and then will combine two of those to form nitrogen gas. So the key on that is when you have saturated soil, water that's wet, the oxygen in that soil column rapidly loses oxygen. And when that happens, then these what we call denitrifying bacteria can start to thrive. And the conditions are just right for them to take the nitrate that's in the water, diffuses through into the sediment, and then goes out as nitrogen gas.
And emitting nitrogen gas into the atmosphere is not a problem. And I'm going to recall my science classes. Nitrogen is the primary component of air, is that correct?
Right. So it's not an environmental problem to release into gas.
Okay. We've been talking about wetlands. I want to broaden the discussion just a little bit because you've been looking at prairie restoration, you've been looking at savanna restoration. Is that in conjunction with this, or is that a separate entity?
Well, I might let John talk a little bit about that. A lot of that work's done on, we've been working on their farm.
Right. I mean,
restoring.
some of those, there was a prairie restoration that was a little bit of experiment to try and generate prairie seed. And if you've ever bought seed to repopulate a prairie, it's extremely expensive because it's essentially collected by hand. So it's very labor intensive to collect that seed. So we've got about 10 acres that is going to be expanded into 20 acres. It's a native prairie. And then an area that had traditionally been a savanna, which is just kind of an open forest. Forest isn't the right word, but more of a grassland with kind of mixed trees in there.
Yeah, occasional trees.
Yeah, which if you don't manage that, it quickly becomes overgrown with locusts and honeysuckle and things like that. So there's been a pretty big effort the past couple of years on some of the ground that's close to the river to clean out some of those invasives and try and open that back up to the original savanna to get some of the prairie plants to come back. And I think they come back pretty quickly. It's amazing what's dormant in the soil that if you allow the right conditions of light and things like that, the things that the plants that haven't been there will come back pretty quickly. And I don't know if you've got some examples of some of those that we haven't seen. Then all of a sudden you clear that out, and you think, well, they're coming back, which is always nice
Well,
to see.
Emiquon, it's not a prairie, but Emiquon, farmed for 80, 90 years, add water, and American lotus and everything else comes
Right.
back without doing anything.
We're
Right.
finding the same thing in the wetlands too. I mean, after 80 years of farming, and these are a little different than Emiquon in that some of these do dry out, some of them do stay wet, depending on the tile and how much area it's draining. But we do see a lot of native aquatic plants that just show up. We just finished one a month or two ago, and there's already cattails growing in it, and so it's very. We see the same thing in the savanna and same thing in the wetlands. If you kind of restore that environment.
So is there a benefit to doing savannas and/or restoration of prairies in conjunction with these wetlands in an agriculture environment?
I think they're all part of a picture that helps the whole ecology of the farm. I think in terms of the experiment that the Nature Conservancy is doing, they're not necessarily related. They're things that help with the overall quality of the farm, but in terms of the work on the wetlands, correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, but the savanna is an area that historically would have been grazed with cattle to keep it open, and when you take the livestock away, it closes up pretty quickly. But
I'd say the farm is really unique in that it's really, the Franklins allow us to use it for an outreach tool, an outreach site. So, we've held open house events where we invite the whole county out. We usually get about 125 people that come out and see these different practices. So we'll have a lot of partners that help pull this off. But we'll have someone in the prairie talking about prairie restoration and pollinators, and someone in the savanna talking about different programs that are available if you have this type of habitat on your farmlands. The DNR and others will be down at the river talking about biodiversity and show the mussels and why we're doing this to begin with, and the wetlands and so on. So there's a lot of different conservation practices on the Franklin's farm in place on a really productive farm. And that's kind of one of the really unique things I think about the farm.
With regard to water quality, what's been happening so far really hasn't had any impact on your water source?
Not directly from the wetlands. There are some wetlands that have been constructed very recently in the Lake Bloomington watershed. They're just the start. And also we have an experimental wetland in Evergreen Lake watershed. But we have to scale up and get the whole watershed.
With that in mind, Maria, what's the timetable? Is there, we've seen significant reduction in the use of wetlands, right? Mm-hmm. So what kind of reduction, and what's the timetable? I mean, how, if you can get out your crystal ball, when might Rick be seeing some true impact?
Well, the watershed Rick's talking about is a very large watershed, like 43,000 acres or so. So it would take a while to get in enough wetlands in that entire watershed to actually see changes down at the reservoir. What we've shown at the farm when we monitor the inlets and outlets of these wetlands is that they can reduce depending on the size, anywhere from 30 to 60% of the nitrates. So we know they work. The question is, how can we get those in at scale?
And that question will remain for a discussion maybe a year or two down the road here, or
Right.
maybe longer. We'd like to say thank you very much to John Franklin, who is a
you.
landowner over in the Lexington area. Thank you for joining us. Also Maria Lemke, who is an aquatic ecologist for the Nature Conservancy. Thank you both for joining
you.
us. And also to Rick Twait, who is the Superintendent of Water Quality, Water Purification for the City of Bloomington. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be off for a week, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with another edition of At Issue. Join us then.